Hello everyone, this is Ivan Belostenko. You are watching Idź-Pod-Prąd TV with my guests today, Michał Szczukiewicz here in studio in Lublin, Poland.
Hello.
And with our American correspondent, Alex Newman, with us as well.
Hi, Alex. Ivan. Very nice to be with you. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. Today we'll talk about the summit, of course, but perhaps maybe before we go into the part of the summit, I guess we can call it part of it, that we attended, I wanted to ask you about the comments that we heard from a MSNBC reporter about the uprising fighting against the Nazi Germany, the Nazi regime and the Polish regime. Have you heard that comment from the MSNBC? I think it's Andrea, don't recall the name.
Mitchell,
yes, that's the one.
Yeah.
What do you think? Do you think that's an intentional blip, or was that possibly intended?
Yeah, it's hard to know with MSNBC. You almost have to feel bad for them because MSNBC, we talk about CNN being fake news, but MSNBC is very clearly in that same category. And a lot of times, they're being deliberately dishonest. It's no question about it. But also, I think a lot of them are just very, very ignorant. They went to public school, government school, so they got nothing but fake history and fake civics and propaganda indoctrination. Then they went to university, same thing, more and more. Then they see their colleagues at the TV, and they live in this kind of strange bubble, an alternative reality. So it's hard to know whether they really believe this stuff that they're saying, and they're just ignorant about what really has happened, or they're being deliberately dishonest. We know for sure that a lot of times they're being deliberately dishonest. And MSNBC, I don't know if you guys know in Poland, but MSNBC has a reputation as being the most far left of all the networks, and that's very hard because they're all very, very far to the left, and MSNBC is the most fringe, the most ridiculous, and so really the people who watch that are the most extreme elements of the Democratic Party, the communists, socialists, just people who don't know much about anything. And so it's hard to know whether they actually know this or not, but it could very well be deception.
MSNBC are the best. They are the champions, indeed. So we were at the conference yesterday. Well, not the main conference, but at the rally for Iran. Actually, what you mentioned there is we had the I guess wouldn't say pleasure, but the opportunity to experience what we've seen also with during the Trump after the victory, with the way the reporters behave. We were trying to get, at least record the statement that Giuliani was given to the press, and we were trying to get in there with the microphone, and these folks, and most of them were actually Polish, they were behaving just the same as your media in the States, where I think there was an incident in the White House where they dropped and almost broke something. I think they did broke something. So it was just, they like jump at these people, at these politicians, and they behave like animals, So we had a chance to experience it firsthand, and it was quite shocking. Michael here almost got trumped with, by some of these reporters.
It was very interesting experience, but I think it's probably the normal thing in media stuff.
Yeah, we need to introduce a new normal, because that was embarrassing for for us to see these Polish media behave in that way. I saw that because when we came and approached Giuliani, which we can talk about it next maybe, for the interview, and I said, thank you, sir, for coming to Poland and taking time to to attend the conference and etc. And then I thought to myself, oh, hold on a second, I haven't actually heard any of them greeting him, so it's really even rude, You have people coming from abroad, and they just jump at him with questions. And the poor guy wanted to go to the toilet. They had to use the bodyguards to push the reporters away so he can get to the toilet. The poor guy.
So yeah, well, the media is in such a sad state. I assume the same is true in Poland. It really is just terrible. They don't have ethics. They don't know how to behave, and that's the sad state that journalism is. And I think this is reflected in their work too. When you read most of what passes for journalism today, it really is quite pathetic. And it's a major problem, because the media is where so many people get their information from. And when you have people without ethics, who don't know how to behave themselves, who don't have any understanding of history, don't have any understanding of much of anything, you get a very distorted picture of what's happening in the world. And that's how they're able to deceive so many people, not just journalists, but then the journalists will go out and deceive the world. Just the last week or so, we've been working a lot on climate. In the U.S., they're proposing this Green New Deal. They're going to rearrange the whole economy and end all CO2 emissions. And so many brain-dead reporters say, oh, yay, that's wonderful, we should do that, not realizing that if we actually did that, most of us would die. Right? So they're so easy to manipulate. They're so ungrounded, and they have so little background in their frame of reference. So it's, I guess the same is true in Poland, and I think it's probably true around the world. And thank goodness that not everybody's like that, right? You have Front and other good outlets out there that don't behave like this and do have some understanding, but it's rare, unfortunately.
Okay, but can you tell us what can you tell our people, Polish people, about the interview with Giuliani? Do you like it?
I thought it was very good. Yep, and it was nice to be able to see that. I'll say, I have some serious concerns about Giuliani and what he's been up to. I think it's very good that he's been standing alongside Donald Trump right now. He's serving as one of his attorneys in this witch hunt that Robert Mueller is engaging in. For Polish people who don't follow American politics so closely, maybe they don't realize they've appointed now a special prosecutor, which is kind of like a prosecutor who just focuses on one task. And he has been taking down Trump's associates. So most recently, they took down Roger Stone, who's been an advisor to Donald Trump since the 1980s. They went to his house with a SWAT team and arrested him with machine guns. And of course, they called the fake news to be there. They also took down Paul Manafort, who was his campaign manager. And we know Roger Stone. I was at his house doing interviews. I was at his studio doing interviews. And he actually explained a lot of interesting things. He told us that Donald Trump's father was very closely affiliated with the John Birch Society, which I thought was extremely interesting. I think Roger Stone had a big role to play in helping Donald Trump to become president. He's a political strategist with a very keen mind. And so it's no surprise that Robert Mueller took him down. Then Robert Mueller also took down Paul Manafort, who was Trump's campaign manager, also took down Michael Flynn, who was Trump's original national security advisor, all on these phony, ridiculous charges. So we have a big problem here. And Giuliani has been one of the people who has been standing by Trump and helping him out during this. So I appreciate that he's being willing to do that, especially considering the pressure that's on these people right now, where you have a special prosecutor who's trying to bring down everybody that Trump's associated with. But some of Giuliani's views over the years, I have serious concerns about. He's run for president, as you guys probably know, and during the debates, a lot of his views came out. He was, of course, the mayor of New York City during 9/11. And, even more recently, I wrote an article in the NewAmerican about this effort to bring about regime change in Iran. And I'm all in favor of regime change. What I'm not in favor of is the U.S. government getting involved in regime change. And what I'm really not in favor of is this group that Giuliani and John Bolton have aligned themselves with, the Mujaheddin, which apparently has even been paying them. Trump ran on a platform of not getting involved in the affairs of other countries. And I think it would be a very big mistake for this agenda that Giuliani and Bolton are being pushed to be adopted as White House policy, to try to bring about the collapse of the Iranian government and the rise to power of this Mujaheddin. So if you guys want to talk more about them, that would be great. But I think it was a very interesting interview, and I agree with what he said. I think everybody must agree with what he said, that, it's not possible for freedom-loving people to stand alongside the regime in Iran. It's a totalitarian dictatorship. It kills people for non-crimes. It oppresses people. It persecutes Christians and Jews and others. And, it obviously has a desire to undermine the United States and Israel and others. And that's, obviously not acceptable. So I agree with him that this regime is problematic and we shouldn't be standing alongside of it. Where I differ with Giuliani is the idea, and he didn't say this in the interview with you that I saw at least, but where I differ with him is the idea that the U.S. government ought to take some kind of active role in bringing about the downfall of this government and the installation of a new government. Our founding fathers in America were very clear that America is not a country that should be getting involved in the affairs of other nations. We support those who want liberty. We pray for them. We cheer for them, but we don't send our men to go die in their wars, and we don't get involved in their conflicts. Unfortunately, policy in Washington for generations now has been to get involved everywhere all over the world, and typically it has ended very badly. And so I hope they won't make the same mistake in Iran.
Yeah, so if we can talk a little bit more about this NCRI group, the Mujaheddins in Iran, there seems to be, like you mentioned, John Bolton and Giuliani as well supporting them. And I mean, I understand the narrative that the current regime is bad and we have to replace it. But it's also important, I think, to be very careful who are the people who are lined up to take up the space that is going to be vacated once the current regime is going to go away. So can you tell us a little bit more what you know about this group, the NCRI? Because we saw them. The manifestation that took place yesterday, to the rally to which we went, it was organized by them, and we knew that they had these views. But if you can share a bit more details about them, that would be much appreciated.
Sure, I'd be very happy to, Ivan. Thank you. And almost nobody in America knows these things because the media just has not talked about it at all. But this group, the Mujaheddin Khalq, they call it MEK for short. I think the best way to describe it is it's an Islamo-Marxist cult. It tries to fuse the ideology of Marxism with the, I would say, corrupted theology of Islam. I mean, it's not even really Orthodox Islam anymore because, Islam and Marxism are not exactly compatible, although the Soviets did try to bring about this fusion. And, the current regime in Iran also has some ideological similarities, right? They were very closely allied with the Soviet Union. They're still very closely allied with Putin. And, of course, they're also Islamists on the other side, where they're enforcing their view of Islam. So this Mujaheddin Khalq, I think the best way to understand it is a fusion of Marxism and Islam and this kind of cultish cult of personality around the leadership and around these ideas. It's a very strange organization. I mean, when you look at what they believe, it's very, very strange. It's almost unique. And this has long been recognized, even in Washington, D.C., right? This organization was on the U.S. State Department's list of terror organizations until just a few years ago when Obama took them off. And I was very critical of the Obama administration taking them off of the terror list. Nothing substantial had changed. This organization has murdered U.S. military officers in Iran. They've engaged in terror acts. They've killed civilians. And they want to overthrow the government of Iran. And on their own, of course, they can't overthrow the government of Iran because it's a fringe movement that doesn't really have support in Iran. Most of their high-level operatives are actually based in France, right? So this is not a legitimate grassroots movement of Iranian people, many of whom certainly want to get rid of the existing regime. But to get rid of the existing regime and then put in place a new force, it would be just as ridiculous, maybe more ridiculous, I think is absolutely absurd. And one of my big problems with this is that this organization, which seems to have a lot of money, right, and I think that's a question that needs to be asked, where is all this money coming from? But they're putting all sorts of high-level American politicians on the payroll, including Giuliani and John Bolton. I don't know whether that's continued because now they're serving in, essentially public office. But for a time there, they were actually paying many high-level politicians in the United States, not just Republicans, also Democrats, to help them to take over Iran. And I'm sorry, but this idea that the U.S. government is just this kind of Santa Claus, that you give it money and then it goes and overthrows your government and puts you into power, that's ridiculous. That's not what the U.S. government exists for. Our founding fathers created it to protect our rights, to secure our independence, and to guarantee us a Republican form of government and to ensure that we would have liberty going forward, not so that foreign organizations and governments and lobbyists could come and pay money and hijack our policy to, overthrow governments and things like this. So I think it's a very dangerous move. I'm highly suspicious of the MEK, the Mujaheddin Khalq, and Trump, I think, was very clear on the campaign trail. We are not going to be getting involved in other countries. We're not going to be overthrowing governments. We're not going to be waging a bunch of wars around the world. He said this again very recently at the UN Security Council, or the General Assembly. He gave a speech where he said, you let us as Americans do what we want to do. The Americans are going to govern America. We reject the ideology of globalism, and you guys do what you want to do in your countries, right? And I agree with that philosophy. I think Donald Trump hit a home run with that. We may not like things that are going on. We certainly don't want to give any appearance of support. I would argue that a lot of these dictatorships we shouldn't even be treating as legitimate governments, and acting like they're normal governments and sending ambassadors and things like that. And I think the way we've treated Cuba for a long time is quite reasonable. Don't act like it's a legitimate government when some gangster, some thug, some dictator takes over a country. And I think that's a fine policy to adopt with Iran as well. But where I draw the line is going to overthrow their government, getting our people involved, and even worse, installing an Islamo-Marxist cult in power. I have very serious concerns about that.
It's interesting you mentioned that we shouldn't be treating those rogue nations as proper governments, because the ambassador of Iran has been attending Poland before the summit, and he was threatening Poland with consequences, that if they will go and take part in this conference, and that it's going to be really bad for us and stuff like that. So we're really surprised that, well, we weren't really surprised, but it's a shame that in the Polish media, these things are allowed, because this guy was all over the media, the left and the right, they were speaking about him and the possible consequences. So I think that's a useful advice, that we shouldn't be treating them as a proper governments and just, ignoring them at least, or condemning them.
Yeah, and one of the big problems with treating them as a legitimate government is that they send over their spies and their terrorists, and they all have diplomatic immunity. We have this situation in the United States where we have the headquarters of the United Abominations based in New York, and this allows every gangster who's taken over a country, every dictator, every thug, every mass murderer who has managed to seize control of a population to send in a bunch of agents with diplomatic immunity. So our police can't talk to them, our police can't arrest them, we can't even really monitor what they're doing because they have diplomatic immunity. And so when you recognize these brutal governments like the Chinese dictatorship, like the Iranian dictatorship or the Cuban dictatorship, what that means is that they then have the ability to send over a bunch of their agents with diplomatic cover. So, and you have a big problem in Europe right now with the Iranian dictatorship. They have diplomats running all over the continent who are actually, terror paymasters and spies and things like this. And I think that's a big problem. And it's one reason why I would say you don't treat rogue governments as if they were legitimate governments. You don't let them come set up bases in your country and spy on dissidents and orchestrate subversion. I think it's very dangerous. And this incident that you talked about with the Iranian diplomats in your country, I would say that's completely unacceptable. I would say pack your bags, get out of our country, and go back to Iran, please.
So how do you think Iranians should build their new free country? What should be the inspiration for them, the core of this new process?
Yeah, it's a hard question. I would say that every people around the world needs to take responsibility for restoring their own freedom. And the people in Venezuela, I love the people of Venezuela, and they need to take responsibility. Now they're doing that to some extent, going out and protesting. And I think the Iranian people need to do the same. I recognize that that's hard, and I recognize that there are sacrifices involved. I recognize that the Iranian dictatorship might put some of you in prison, might execute some of you. The price of freedom is high. It always is, right? When America became free from Great Britain, we lost many of our finest men in war, right? It's not an easy matter. And Poland, of course, has a lot of experience fighting for freedom, right? It's not an easy thing, and the price is high. But if it's worth it to you, if you don't want to live under oppression, if you don't want to live under a dictatorship and be oppressed and terrorized, then you need to be willing to make that sacrifice. So I hope the people of Iran will restore their freedom, and there's many ways that they can do that. Removing the current government. One of the things that I think is so sad is that they were actually moving toward a free society under the Shah of Iran. We did a fantastic article, actually. My friend and my colleague James Perloff did a very, very good article in Iran about Iran, where he explained how globalists, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Rockefeller family, and these guys had organized the coup against the Shah. The Shah of Iran. The Shah of Iran wasn't perfect, but he was a reformer. He was quite moderate. He believed in allowing the people to have rights. And very subversive forces operating out of New York and out of Washington, D.C., ensured that he would be betrayed and overthrown and portrayed as some kind of dictator. And that was absolutely tragic. And as a result of that, Iran is now in the situation that it's in now. So I would say we definitely don't want to make it worse by supporting the MEK and getting in there. But it's very sad that in so many of these interventions where the U.S. government has gotten involved, Cuba is another good example, right? The Council on Foreign Relations here in the United States, they had one of their reporters, Herbert Matthews, was writing in the fake New York Times that Fidel Castro was the next George Washington of Cuba and that he was a freedom fighter. He was an anti-communist freedom fighter. And you had criminals in our U.S. State Department arming Castro and making weapons blockades against Batista, the former president of Cuba. So actually our ambassador to Cuba, Earl Smith, wrote a book about how the U.S. government and these globalist forces within it actually put Fidel Castro in power. You guys in Poland are quite familiar with this. I talked to Pastor Pavel, and he has read the book, as have I. I saw Poland betrayed by the U.S. ambassador to Poland, Arthur Bliss Lane. So we have a problem in the United States where so many of our government institutions have been infiltrated by globalists, by subversives, by people who hate freedom, and they've made the world much worse. And so now Trump is trying to drain that swamp and trying to clear some of that nest of subversives out. But I think the first step is to rein them in and prevent them from doing more damage in places like Iran, and let the Iranian people do their own thing. When it appears that the U.S. government is supporting uprisings and things, it automatically becomes discredited, not just in the public imagination, but it gives the government an excuse to come and start arresting people. What government is going to tolerate a foreign government supporting its overthrow? I mean, no government would tolerate that. The Polish government would not tolerate that, nor would the U.S. government, and quite properly. If some foreign government was funding an uprising here in the United States, they would all be arrested, and quite properly so. So I think the way for Iran to become free is for the public to have an appreciation for freedom and then be willing to make the sacrifices that it takes.
And thank you for that. And I also wanted to ask you, what do you think in general about the conference so far, the Peace and Security Conference, and some of the statements that we heard?
To be honest, I haven't followed it as closely as I should have. What I've seen, it looks quite interesting. What I've heard from you guys looks quite interesting. But, wherever there's these kind of interventionist sentiments expressed, this idea that the U.S. government has an obligation to police the world, whenever I hear that kind of rhetoric, I get suspicious. The U.S. government is $22 trillion in debt. The State Department is still filled with subversives. In fact, efforts to rout out the subversives by the Trump administration have been met with very, very fierce resistance. The fake news has been coming after them. The globalist organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations has been coming after them. So I'm always, suspicious and skeptical of these types of things. I hope there will be a positive end to it. And of course, I'm very happy to see Polish-U.S. relations improving and being warm. I think Poland and Hungary, these are countries that we have a lot in common with and we should be having relations with. So that I think is very encouraging. But to the extent that these sentiments that we ought to intervene in other people's countries are coming up, I think that really needs to be resisted. That's not what the American people voted for. And I hope that senior officials in the Trump administration will keep in mind what their boss has been saying all the time. I think what Trump has been saying is exactly the kind of policy we ought to be pursuing. And I would hope that would happen.
Okay. What can you tell us about Mike Pence? And he mentioned about Lech Wałęsa. Is Wałęsa still so popular in the United States? Because in Poland there are much more bad things about him in media and in public. So why Mike Pence told about Wałęsa and told that he's the hero for Poland, for What do you think about
And
it?
also Pompeo was had a, we don't know if it's bad informants, that people who briefed them, but he also mentioned a person that was given to him to mention, to sort of, give a good sentiment in Polish people's ears. But he was also a former communist, involved with the communist
Code
party.
name.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was codenamed Bullock, right?
No, I'm talking about the person who Mike Pompeo mentioned. He was also he was given to him, this person, I don't remember the name, but
Okay.
he was given to him to mention as a, maybe to steer emotions in the Polish people, that of admiration and stuff like that. But this guy was a collaborator.
Yeah, see, it doesn't surprise me, and unfortunately, most Americans don't actually realize that Lech Walesa has now been exposed as a collaborator with the communist authorities, and we've been writing about this in the New American for many, many years. In fact, I've written several articles about it, following the documents that have been released about Lech Walesa and the public statements that have been made, and I'm very relieved to see these people being exposed. Unfortunately, this information has not circulated as widely as it should among the American people. I've even heard anti-communist organizations. I went up to a conference put on by the Victims of Communism, which is a very large anti-communist organization in the United States, and some of the presenters were praising Lech Walesa, and this was after all these documents came out showing that he was collaborating with the communist authorities. So I think it's very troubling. It's hard to know how much of that is a result of ignorance and how much of it is deliberate, because, as I mentioned, the State Department is so infiltrated with globalists, with subversives, with socialists. It's very possible that the people who wrote these speeches, who briefed the higher level officials, could know all this and have mentioned it anyway. But it's really hard to know. But I do think anybody who's serving in high-level positions in the U.S. government needs to be very familiar with all this background, because you can't understand geopolitics unless you understand this. And I would argue that they ought to be familiar with the books that Anatoly Golitsyn wrote, for example, where he predicted many years before it happened that there was going to be a fake liberalization in Eastern Europe, that there was going to be a fake collapse of the Soviet Union, and that the communists would maintain their positions of power all over the place. So I think everybody at least ought to be familiar with these allegations, because you start to see things in a very different way. And I think this explanation actually makes the most sense about what's been happening. If you read New Lies for the Old or the Perestroika deception, for high-level U.S. policymakers to be completely oblivious to this, I think it's almost inexcusable. And so I would hope that the American people and the Polish people would make sure that their elected representatives, that their officials are aware of this stuff. And again, I don't know whether this was ignorance or whether some subversive had briefed them and had written their speeches. But either way, it's very troubling. I think officials have a responsibility to make sure the people who are giving them their briefings are giving them accurate information. They have a duty to make sure that their subordinates are not subversive or involved in other things, and they have a duty to be well educated about the areas in which they're working. If your policy area includes Eastern Europe, you ought to be very familiar with these things. So either way, I think it's very troubling.
And have you heard anything about this Kushner, not Kushner's plan, well, it is Kushner's plan, I think, that he was going to reveal some of the plans for Israel that is now, as we know, are going to be revealed fully after the elections in Israel. Have you heard anything about this plan, and is it possibly inscribing a confirmation of a Palestinian state next to the Israeli state?
I've heard those same rumors, and I don't know how true they are, but I do know that I don't trust Jared Kushner at all, or his wife Ivanka Trump, and I think from my opinion as an American, I don't want to intervene in Israeli politics, but in my view, this whole idea of a two-state solution, that we're going to evict a whole bunch of Israelis from Judea and Samaria, I don't think that's an appropriate policy. Having been to Judea and Samaria, having met the communities there, the idea that we're just going to uproot them all and create another Arab state called Palestine, to me, it just doesn't really make sense. I think there already are a lot of Arab states. There's no need to make another one, have a permanent problem there with Israelis and Arabs. So I don't like that policy idea, and I understand that's what Jared Kushner is pursuing. And it's hard to know. As far as I know, the official details of the plan haven't been announced yet. But as I understand from Israeli friends, this is not going to be a good deal for them. And I think it's disappointing if that's where we go with this. I think we'll have to wait to see what the official proposal is. But if what I'm hearing is true, I have some very serious concerns about it.
Yeah, of course, the uprooting of communities in Israel have been tried with Gaza many times before in other places. And what happened with Gaza, for example, is the communities have been uprooted, the Palestinians have moved in, and now we just have given them a closer range of missiles that they can, reach other cities. And it's just totally pointless, because we know that these countries don't understand diplomacy. The only way that you can speak with them is by being forceful, being in a position of power, not in a position of of weakness.
Yeah, and actually, the last time I was in Israel, we did what I think was an extremely interesting interview with the member of the Knesset, Moshe Feiglin. He at the time was the deputy speaker of the Knesset, and I encourage people to go read that. He just had some incredible insights into what's happening in Israel, this idea of a two-state solution, and the broader context of the region. So if people want to read that, they can find it at NewAmerican.com. It's an interview with MK Moshe Feiglin, who at that time deputy speaker, and he had a lot of, I think, very insightful comments about this issue with the Arabs, about Iran, about the future of Israel. Very, very insightful, and that really, I think that interview has helped shape my perspective on the whole conflict, on the whole issue, in a very positive way. I started seeing things differently after hearing from him. It just seemed to make so much sense. So I hope people will go take a look at that. It was, in my opinion, fascinating.
Yeah. Well, we'll definitely check it out and perhaps maybe publish that and add the links to this video below, as well as all the other things that we've mentioned about. I think maybe we'll call it a day for today. For this show. Thank you very much, Alex, for being with us. I appreciate you taking the time to talk about these important issues. And with me in studio as well was Michal Szukewicz.
Thank you very much.
Thank you guys very much.
Alex. Thanks for the viewers, and we'll see you next time.
Wonderful. Thank you, gentlemen.